We've been talking our way through the history of forest recreation and land management from, ancient Mesopotamia and the prehistoric period up to about 60,000 years ago with the invention of the bow and arrow for hunting and presumably recreation purposes at that time. Now mostly recreation purposes, including hunting. And we've gotten as far as kind of the mid-1960s. So we kind of left off talking about the 1964 advent or start of the wilderness preservation system. So we left off the discussion talking about how in 1964 Congress ordered the National Park Service and the United States Forest Service and the other primary federal land management agencies to pull out their maps and look for core interior habitat that was minimally or not at all developed. So all the places which were trackless in the legislation, so meaning no roads or trails. Plenty of wildlife and animal tracks, hopefully, in those core habitat spaces. But a bunch of folks, starting in kind of the 30s and 40s, mostly in the Forest Service, actually, up in Minnesota and Wisconsin, have been getting together and working as foresters and thinking, gosh, we are really getting pretty scarily good at all of this forestry in terms of resource extraction, in terms of conversion from natural resource to board feet of timber. We're really good at that. We can absolutely clear-cut entire quadrants of the United States, period, in like a decade or two. And so this was the forestry equivalent of what the wildlife aficionados, enthusiasts, and also the wildlife industry had experienced kind of a rude awakening about back in the late 1800s, right? So it took like a decade for us to hunt bison down from millions to a few private herds total. And so in the face of the capability far outpacing or far outstripping the ethic, the design, the responsible, sustainable management of forests, between 1930 and 1960, these conversations are starting to not just be interesting thought experiments. What if we set aside part of our national forest for not logging? Wouldn't that be kind of interesting and neat? It moved from that to, man, we got to do this, otherwise there's not going to be any core interior wildlands left. And a big part of the rhetoric or the prose of the discussion about wilderness was maybe we can't replace it with like a replanted wild area. Maybe it is fundamentally lost to us if we cut it over and replant it, if we graze it real hard and then bring the cattle out. They've fundamentally and permanently altered those landscapes, those ecosystems. And crucially, the defining point about the wilderness discussion was, don't we as Americans need more than cheap beef? We're not supporting feet of timber. Right? We need wild places, or otherwise we're going to become softer, weaker, sicker, hollowed out, right? And it's kind of a remarkable conversation to be having as a country in this time, because we didn't really have a vocabulary for a lot of this stuff at that time, right? So some folks like Howard Zahnizer, who was a newspaperman, other folks, again, a lot of folks in forestry circles. Arthur Carhart is a big name in wilderness development. Edward Abbey, who's kind of a salty, leave me alone, I just want to go work in this national park, and if everybody could just fuck right off, I would really appreciate that, because man, even bringing people to national parks is kind of an affront or a travesty to these national parks. Interesting guy, Ed Abbey. If you've ever read Desert Solitaire, you know what I'm talking about. Or his eco-terrorism novel, The Monkey Wrench Gang, or any of his other works. He was the first essentially staffer or ranger at Arches National Monument at that time. Now it's a national park. But he saw that place go from a pretty inaccessible and beautiful and stark desert landscape, with all these gorgeous rock formations and such outside of Moab, Utah, which was at that point just a uranium mining town, to one of the crown jewel busiest national parks in the United States and therefore in the world. And he wasn't super comfortable with paving roads through national parks and filing away all the rough edges and so forth. And so this is what brings us to Congress agreeing with folks and saying, look, we're not really going to set aside any new lands for this, but we acknowledge that a lot of our national parks, our wildlife refuges, our forests, and our national forest system, okay, yeah, maybe we could like super designate them. So they're still part of whatever national park or forest that they're in, but they are also now especially protected and designated and restricted from lots of different sort of ruinous over time uses and activities as federally designated wilderness. So this is us still 50 years later, right? In 1916, we create the United States National Park Service. 48 years later, we get the Wilderness Act. And we're still trying to figure out, okay, so what does a national park mean? And it's a pretty good definition up until this point. But for some places that are just too wild to be civilized and conquered and tamed and with a Starbucks in the visitor center and so forth, let's call that part of each national park, or those parts of national parks and national forests, right? Shawnee National Forest has, 5 or 6 federally designated wilderness areas inside of it? It's not just a monolithic thing. So, in the mid-1960s, we get that. And we also, the following year, get the hugely influential, if you're into any of this stuff, the Land and Water Conservation Act. This is Congress 50 years after the national park system is formally established and created and organized. We get the Land and Water Conservation Act to help pay for, this is a checkoff or an excise tax on making sure that we have congressional level funding, federal funding, to acquire land. To when we set up a place like Shawnee National Forest or Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge, kind of mid-century, not too far from this time period, we have to buy a bunch of land from private landowners to take over that land in a process called eminent domain, where the government comes in and says, for the good of everybody, or at least all Americans, we're going to buy your farm, and you have to leave. And we're going to turn this farm and a bunch of the other farms around it, we're also going to buy up, into Shawnee National Forest. That is literally exactly what happened. And the farmers are given fair market rate. Like, the federal government is not wanting to be in a position of seeing forcibly taking land from people and just saying, all right, you gotta leave, go somewhere else, good luck. That would destroy those families economically. So this is Congress trying to do a little bit better than what we did with Native Americans, just like breaking treaties, pushing them off of land and so forth, and saying just go somewhere else. We've got this reservation on this, terrible marginal land in the Southwest, super dry, can't grow anything, good luck. In 1965, we finally get the country to the point of, all right, we need to be real organized about this, and we need to be fair and equitable with everybody about it. So that is what that legislation does. So in 2014, 10 years ago, we had the 50th anniversary of wilderness. And there we go, fresh memes. And the Shawnee National Forest, which is home to 5 or 6 wilderness areas. Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge, right, has 1 or a couple. So we have 6 or 7 federally designated wilderness areas within about a 1-hour radius of where you're sitting right now. There are very few places in the entire country where we have that many separate wilderness areas that accessible. So I don't want you guys to miss this while you're here at SIU before you, blast off and get an amazing forestry career and living and working in Alaska or down in Patagonia doing international conservation or out in Colorado or Wyoming, wherever. Understand that we have a lot of really good stuff real close to home right here. And when you start working out in those big western states, driving an hour just to get groceries is not at all uncommon versus us having groceries right at hand and a ton of wilderness areas within that radius as well. So, Shawnee National Forest, the Forest Service, celebrated this, and we got a whole bunch of statistics in the fine print here. I'm not worried about memorizing any of that stuff, but this was a big celebration, right? So the 50-year anniversary was a big birthday party for wilderness in 2014. Now, around this time, in the mid-century, so going back to the mid-1960s, 1966 is going to be the 50-year birthday of the National Park Service, created in 1916. So in 1956, 10 years before we're about to hit the 50-year anniversary, the semi-centennial celebration of this major federal land management agency, in 1956, the Park Service starts this thing called Mission 66. So this is the 1950s. We're in the Korean War. We've just finished World War II, absolutely in living memory, like 10 years before, 10, 11 years before. And so the government's style of doing stuff, as you'll learn in Natural Resources Planning class with Dr. Akmani, the approach is called rational comprehensive, or very sort of government expert-driven, top-down planning. And so calling Mission 66 this, giving the National Park Service like a mission, like a military organization, is very much sort of a hallmark of that time period of land management. And so the idea of Mission 66 was, let's take these next 10 years between 1956 and 1966, and all of these sort of slapped together visitor centers, bunch of muddy, dusty dirt roads that have been beat to death for the last 40, 50 years, because these parks used to be run by the United States Cavalry, and they're not really a land management organization, they're not really equipped for that kind of stuff. Because a lot of the first national parks before the Park Service was created in 16, it was just like a coalition of local not-for-profits, state governments trying to run national parks as like partially a state park, but as a collabo, or a versus, as we call it today, maybe. They say, all right, we got a decade, we got this birthday coming, let's modernize everything. And so we have this whole generation of visitor centers, observation towers, lodges, 1950s style cafeterias, set up in sort of the front country, the developed portions, the accessible areas of all of these national parks. And it takes 10 years to do it because that's a lot of construction, a lot of design and engineering work to lay in new roads and even new highways through some of these parks. So this is the era in which the park system gets a major facelift, because in 1956, right, it's been 10 years since World War II, and the bean counters in DC and elsewhere are saying, gosh, we have all these war fighters back, they're making big families, everybody is interested in coming to these parks, our economy is popping right now, and shoot, when all of these little babies that were born between 1945 and 1956 today, when those kids all come of age, our parks are going to get swarmed. And in fact, that's exactly what we saw happen in that column chart we saw on Tuesday, right? So doubling of national park visitation traffic, need for campsites, trails, visitor centers, parking lots, flush toilets, all that stuff. Mission 66 is the Park Service's way of saying, let's throw ourselves a party and kind of future-proof our parks for the next 50 years. Pretty ambitious thing. And so there's a whole bunch of architecture characteristic of this. Now, a lot of concrete construction at this time, but they were just starting to figure out maybe we should, make these visitor centers look like they fit here. So each one, we're starting to move in the direction of let's use native fill material ballast in this concrete so it looks like it's color matched to the local minerals and stuff like that. And this has really, really advanced probably in the last 20 years. So the Park Service at Arches National Park, where Ed Abbey used to work, but when it was a national monument, the visitor center there is beautiful and from certain angles just fades right into the massive hundreds of feet high sandstone wall behind it because it's clad in sandstone. And at Denali National Park, you can drive right by the visitor center because it's sort of half set into the slope and the road goes above that spot, so you're looking down on sort of the sod roof and all this stuff, and it's amazing. The Park Service is trying to switch from hey, let's run this place like a neighborhood park but just super fancy, to hey, let's fit our human presence into this landscape in a way that doesn't kind of adulterate the landscape quite so much. So Mission 66 is just sort of the starting point of that effort. But it really sort of broke the old model of this is a place where a few rich people who have the money to get across non-existent highways and so forth, or take a month-long train trip to visit Yellowstone National Park. This is the Park Service visibly and definitively pivoting from that to, all right, these parks are for everybody. Let's make sure we have enough facilities and high enough quality facilities and good-looking enough facilities and everything, and let's open this wide out to everybody. It's a super democratic thing. Very beautiful. All right, so that's Mission 66. And they also go on sort of this big advertising blitz, right, saying, hey, why don't you come to our national parks in 1966 and every year before and after, because, man, we have some things cooking, and these places are amazing, and we don't want anybody to miss out, right? So that's a pretty wild message in the middle of stuff like, right, the civil rights era, that whole set of battles, gender equity battles, immigration is pretty interesting and intense at this time. So the Park Service throwing it wide to everybody and putting real resources into making it accessible and welcoming for everybody, pretty big deal. In the latter half of the 1960s, we have a whole bunch of legislation. So again, I'm not going to quiz you guys on what dates these happened. I'm more just interested in what decade was this in, and what's the one-sentence summary of what this act did. So in 1968, we get the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which is passed the same year as the National Trails System Act. And in that year, in one big fell swoop, we get things like the Appalachian Trail, funded and supported and taken over by the National Park Service. It crosses 14 states. The International Appalachian Trail goes up into Canada and down through all the way out to the Florida Keys. And only a federal agency could really handle that. And up to this point, it had been kind of a piecemeal Appalachian Trail, just sort of, again, managed by local groups and enthusiasts. Now it gets resources. Now there is a headquarters for the Appalachian Trail. Now there are staff whose job is to patrol the Appalachian Trail. Not a bad gig if you can get it. And so forth, right? And so the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, National Trail System Act gives us not just national scenic trails like the Appalachian Trail and the Continental Divide Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail from Canada to Mexico. The National Trail System Act also gives us national recreation trails, which are not designed to be super pretty, but they're designed to handle getting used for lots of different kinds of recreation, mounted, unmounted, so on foot or on horse or whatever, other pack animals, as intensively as anybody cares to, right? Even some sections of national recreation trails are suitable for motorized recreation use like dirt bikes and so forth. And so we also set up the National Historic Trails, like we were talking about at the beginning of the semester with the Mosaic system. We have the Lewis and Clark Trail, for example. Trail of Tears. We have all sorts of different national historic trails, not so much to provide a new hiking experience, but more to acknowledge and interpret and tell the stories, keep the torch lit for important eras of America's history, like the Lewis and Clark expedition, like the unfortunate Trail of Tears history, and so forth. So positive and embarrassing national stories. The Park Service curates those for us now. In 1968, we get that Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and we get the flowing version of those national trails as well. So now, even just at Ozark Scenic Riverways, which was the first wild and scenic riverway set up by that system in 1968, that is, it's what, 150 plus miles of flowing trails that you don't have to ride a horse along. You can if you want to. You can float and let the river carry all of your heavy camping stuff. It's nice, right? So there's a whole bunch of these all over the country, and this was an interesting take for the United States National Park Service to look at rivers as a trail, not just as a physical flowing resource for things like industry and so forth and navigation, but also as a recreation resource, specifically as a trail infrastructure resource. So we don't have to do trail maintenance on sections of river that are flowing because there's no dirt trail surface to manage, right? Interesting take, very creative one for the 1960s. We also get NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. And so this is the federal government in the 60s acknowledging that sometimes the government is here to help, but despite their best efforts, it doesn't always go perfectly. Imagine that. So the National Environmental Policy Act requires land management organizations or agencies to tell the public what they are finna do, getting ready to do with an environmental assessment. And an environmental assessment is, we want to put in this new, recent example, visitor center at Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge. Every construction project, every improvement project, every maintenance project, you gotta have somebody on that project tally up all the things you're gonna change about the natural environment of that space. And what are the effects over time, both to the environment and to people, to the economy, to local communities? What are those gonna be? So the EA for putting in a new, not previously existing visitor center at Crab Orchard Wildlife Refuge would be like, all right, so here's a map. Here's where we're gonna put a parking lot off the highway. Here's where we're gonna put the building. This is how big it's gonna be. These are the construction materials we're gonna use. Here's how much carbon that concrete is gonna put into the atmosphere for future generations to have to deal with. This is how many acres of wetland locally we're gonna have to fill in and cap off with a parking lot so that there's parking for this visitor center. And here's where we're going to recreate those functional, high quality acres of wetland habitat to offset what we are destroying for the sake of this parking area. And so an environmental impact statement is kind of a similar thing, but further on down the line. It's a very specific encapsulation of not just like a single construction project, but for the broader question of like, how are we gonna deal with visitors at Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge? We'd have to put together an environmental impact statement, an EIS, for that. And this is a couple-year-long effort where Fish and Wildlife Service, in this case, has to put out typically at least 3 or 4 different options of plans. And one of those might be, we're gonna do nothing, typically. Meaning, we're not gonna put in a new visitor center. Our old visitor center is just too old and busted. We have to close it down because it's not safe anymore. But if we don't put in a new one, here's the environmental impact of not putting in a new one. Very small environmental impact. Our second option might be to put in kind of like or just repair the current one. So put a new roof on it, update the plumbing, stuff like that. That's going to cost this much. It's not going to change any environmental impact. Maybe we process the stormwater a little bit better with a better rain catchment system, something like that. So positive environmental impact in that regard. Our third option, we want to put in a new visitor center somewhere else, shut down the old one. We're going to have to fill in some of those environmental, fill in some of those wetlands and ameliorate that by building other wetland elsewhere on property and so forth. And then the fourth option is, okay, if we just got stupid money, like let's make a space age visitor center. Let's make a floating, flying visitor center. Let's just go fucking hog wild. All right? And so the agency puts together those 3 or 4 options: a do nothing, a sort of a minimal or maintenance option, like a new construction flavor option, and then a go hog wild option. And they tally up all the effects of all of those, economically, environmentally, etc., and they put it out to the public. And they list it in what's called a Federal Register. And anybody can go read the Federal Register. It used to be just like a newspaper. And it lists all of the projects that the federal government is doing that are not classified. And you can write in to the organization under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and say, I can't believe you guys are doing this because my family's house is right down slope and you're gonna destroy our entire property with overland flow from this parking lot. I know because I just looked at the blueprints for this lot that you guys were forced to publish, and I'm gonna sue you if you do this option. And so NEPA provides people information to do things like sue the government if they stand to be injured or damaged by the government. It also requires the agency to have public input sessions. So like they might take over a local town hall 3 times over the course of a year and just be like, hey, on this Tuesday night, come on in, we'll have some coffee for you, and you can tell us anything you want to about your thoughts or perspective or how you're concerned about this future project. And we have to not only record and catalog everything that you said, we have to answer for that. Maybe not that night, right? Because sometimes somebody will raise a question of, have you thought about the woodpecker habitat? And it's like, oh geez, we didn't know that there were woodpeckers there, let's go figure this out. But over the course of the project, the agency has to show that they are aware of and dealing with and incorporating and working in as many of those comments as they possibly can, and responsibly and clearly doing so. So when people sue the government under NEPA, it's typically for something that the agency failed to take into account, or the person or organization doing the suing disagrees with it. So like, what do you guys know about the logging drama on the Shawnee over the last 30, 40 years?
Should they, shouldn't they? Like, we don't want it, but then we do want it. It's like back and forth.
Right. And they cannot win for losing. Like, they have tried every which way. And they finally open logging back up. But it was under legislation like this that organizations like Heartland, I think the Sierra Club has also brought suit, organizations like the Environmental Defense Fund, if they disagree with an agency's environmental assessment on a new logging plan or timber sale, something like that, this is how agencies get dragged into court and stopped. So a federal judge will issue what's called an injunction, which means stop what you're doing and let's figure this out. And then the court case goes on and on and on, and the judge might say, okay, I've reviewed your EIS. It does address this, just not how the Sierra Club, for example, was hoping for, but you guys have done the math, you've provided the data, you've given us the GIS layers and the wildlife habitat assessments and all of this stuff, and this all checks out, you're good to go. And they rule in favor of the agency. And in some cases they don't, like on the Shawnee, where the judge says, you know what, Forest Service, you didn't account for what these guys are talking about. You can't do this timber sale. We're going to shut this down, and you can't do any timber sales until you do XYZ, right? So, as a forester, practically speaking, what this means for you and me out in the field is if somebody doesn't like how you're running such and such national forest or national park or whatever, and there's state level equivalents of all this stuff. If somebody doesn't like that, any of your stakeholders or constituents or publics, if they don't like it, they can shut you down. And a lot more damage or problems can even happen in that time while things are shut down. So on the Shawnee, non-native invasive species could be partially addressed by selective timber sales, right? Responsible timber stand improvement practices. And when that gets shut down by a judge who may not have any training, probably doesn't have any training as a forester, now you have other folks deciding how your land's effectively going to get managed until this court case is resolved, right? So that can put you in an interesting spot. That can put you in a very interesting spot. Okay, so National Environmental Policy Act is a pretty big deal for you and me and everybody who has to live with the results of federal decisions made by other people who've never met us or sometimes even been where we are concerned about or where we're living. So that is supposed to be a way for us regular humans to kind of take a little bit of control back, or at least be involved in the process, right? So this is going to help the federal government move beyond that rational, comprehensive, when we want your opinion, public, we'll shove our hands up your butt and sock puppet your mouth, and we'll tell you what opinion to have. That rational, comprehensive approach to more of an adaptive management approach, where we have to consider multiple different competing options and which way to go, to co-management, to community-based natural resources management, where the federal agency, maybe the on-paper land manager, is ultimately only one of many people at that table making consensus-based decisions instead of top-down approach. In 1973, we get the Endangered Species Act. So 100 years after we shoot all the bison almost to extinction, we finally get some legislation saying, hey, we can't do this, or by inaction, allow it to be done. And so this sets up strong protections. And in this era, interestingly, environmental legislation is bipartisan. So this is when the conservative part of the United States, half the entire country, conservative was closely associated with land conservation, right? So Richard Nixon signed a whole bunch of this environmentally oriented legislation, and it was a slam dunk. Like, everybody was like, yeah, we should definitely not have extincted species on our watch, and this is how we're going to do that, right? Set up designation and protection systems for rare, threatened, or endangered species that automatically supersede other land management decisions and procedure structures. If something is endangered, it shuts down everything else on that spot, or shuts down any potential changes to that spot, and puts resources into the hands of folks trying to protect those endangered species or rare, threatened, or endangered communities. It cannot be, in some cases, a single individual species. It might be the combination of plant and wildlife species or insects and so forth all together that's very rare or unique. 1976, kind of a decade later, we get the National Forest Management Act, and we start to get systematized, structured planning frameworks to scaffold things like the National Environmental Policy Act, environmental assessments, and impact statements. So this is where we get sort of the prototypes of things like the Forest Service, BIM, Visitor Impact Management. And this is a management framework for Canadian parks following America's lead. We get the VAMP system. In the United States National Park Service, right around the same time, we start to see the seeds of the VERP framework, Visitor Experience Resource Protection. And so, you don't have to write this down, this is for a future class, but this is where you get assemble team, identify stakeholders, inventory resources, determine values held by stakeholders and team members attached to each one of this hundreds of pages long list of resources, biological, cultural, broader society, sociological, geographic resources, topographic resources, all of this. What do people care about in relation to those? Why are they on the inventory list? And then from there, figure out goals. How do we want to protect and manage for all these values we've identified? Okay, how specifically are we going to do that? All those objectives. And then how are we going to track that? Let's find specific things we can measure, so indicators. And then how do we know if our indicators are good or bad? Let's set standards for them, thresholds or cutoffs. And then let's monitor by remeasuring indicators, comparing them to our standards, and when our indicators are out of bounds according to our standards, well then we're gonna jump in and manage and do forestry and do visitor management and so forth. This legislation is the first shot at setting up a systematic framework for getting to the day-to-day work, right? And it's all about figuring out why are we gonna do it? How are we gonna do it this way? And why are we doing it that way? Before we get to the fire part, this is the ready aim part, right? Lots and lots of steps up to this point. So after monitor, small increment, we have manage, and we cyclically monitor and manage until we sunset this plan after 15, 25, 30 years, because reality has shifted beyond that, and we make a new plan by assembling a new team and rinse and repeat. Okay? So it's not until the 1970s that we get the government figuring out, yeah, we should probably have like a recognizable way to do this stuff instead of just like, throwing together ad hoc committees to figure out what the next national park should be and stuff like that. So, NFMA is super boring, but super important, right? And it is absolutely responsible for creating resource planning as a profession. So every national park has an office full of planners. Every forest has one or more planning staff figuring out, all right, where are we steering this ship and how are we going to get it there? That sort of thing, right? So for those of you who if you like to be kind of more of a strategic thinker instead of the person out there with the pole saw doing hazard tree remediation, NFMA, again, created the context for you to be that chess player with the entire forest instead of being on-site managing a thing. So something you could look into. Natural resource planning is a field or a discipline in grad school, for example, so you can go that direction if that appeals to you. In 1979, right? So in 1964, we get the Wilderness Act. 15 years later, in 1979, we get the Roadless Area Review and Evaluation number 2. Now, Roadless Area Review and Evaluation 1 was the Wilderness Act. And so number 2 in 1979, 15 years later, is Congress circling back with all these federal land management agencies who had the chance now to identify and create or designate Generation 1 wilderness areas, which according to the Wilderness Act had to be big. It had to be big enough to absorb a 2-week pack trip. All right, so if you figure somebody walking 15 miles a day for 14 days, that's almost 225 miles, right? That's a pretty big area. If you have a single trail of 225 miles or so, 210 miles, that's what that legislation called for. And anything smaller than that couldn't be wild enough to be wilderness because it was too small to kind of get lost for 2 weeks in. Is sort of the general qualitative idea there. In 1979, Congress says, all right, you've got the Gen 1 stuff in place. This is good. It's time to roll out the PlayStation 5 Pro version. So now go back to those maps and look at all the places that were just a little bit too small, which was all of the green spaces, all of the forests, all of the parks east of the Mississippi, right? Because everything east of the Mississippi, even just like the states, are physically smaller than a bunch of the stuff out west. So we have a bunch of huge wilderness areas designated in 15 years out west. Out east, where all the population lives, or 60% of the population lives at this time, like, we have to go to those western states through the flyover states to enjoy wilderness. So Congress is saying, okay, let's relax that standard of size, if nothing else, just a little bit, and let's relax that standard of it being a trackless place. So through Rare 2, that's how we got our half dozen wilderness areas on the Shawnee, because most of them are really pretty small. They're beautiful, they're amazing, and they also used to be a bunch of old hill farms, right? So there are a bunch of old roads, century-old roads, in the middle of these eastern wilderness areas, and the Forest Service is allowed to designate those as wilderness, and crucially, now they don't have to maintain those forest roads. The Forest Service is responsible for maintaining 250,000 miles of forest roads. That's hard, that's expensive, and it's not really forestry, right? Like, we don't get into this to like fix potholes all day long. But that's part of what the Forest Service has to do, right? We got to maintain this network of roads so we can do things like extract timber or run rally races through Shawnee National Forest at 100 miles an hour and so forth. So Rare 2 gave the rest of us wilderness that's a lot closer to where we live so we can actually use it, and then instead of just acknowledging the existential value of big wildernesses way far away in some other state that I'll probably never visit because they're far away, because they're so huge, it's gonna take a 2-week pack trip just to even start enjoying it, right? We can go to Bald Knob Wilderness or Clear Springs Wilderness or Burden Falls Wilderness here on the Shawnee for lunch, you know? And it's nice. Or we could go for probably a week-long backpacking trip, stringing a couple of those wilderness areas together, like Burden Falls Clear Creek and Bald Knob Wilderness are like physically next to each other, two lobes of the same area. So this is Congress starting to sophisticate and not just sort of create the idea of a federally designated wilderness as a new kind of park. It's also sophisticating to the point of, let's make this actually work for people instead of just being a thing on the map somewhere else, right? Alaska has amazing, enormous federally designated wilderness parcels. And like 99.99% of all of us are never gonna go up there and see them, right? Because it's like a whole ass day just to get there, even if you're flying. Like, Alaska is big and far away. The following year, speaking of Alaska, in 1980, we get ANILCA, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. And overnight, when the president signed this legislation into existence, it doubled the entire acreage in the national park system like that. Alaska is big. Though most of us will never get there, it's amazing. So we could take a bunch of Alaskan land that was beautiful. The tallest peak in North America is in Alaska, in the Alaska Range. We call it Denali now. It used to be called Mount McKinley after a dead president, but since 1980, there's been kind of this movement to, sort of decolonize some geonyms or place names, and Denali was one of those. The key feature of the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, aside from setting aside millions and millions and millions of acres in wildlife refuges, so Arctic National Wildlife Refuges up there, in national forests up there with some current gold mining controversies, a whole bunch of national parks up there, right? Much of Alaska is in federal land management. But the key feature of ANILCA as a piece of legislation was trying to be different and better than the Wilderness Act, the Organic Act that created the National Park Service, and similar legislation that created Fish and Wildlife, etc., was saying, hey, if you're a Native American, if you're a First Nations person like Inuit, for example, and your people have been living in Alaska for millennia and doing just fine, thank you very much, before we locked up all this land as national park and national forest and wildlife refuge, you can continue to use these newly designated federal lands in your traditional way, because we're taking over a lot of the habitat for the species that your entire culture is founded upon. So this is a lesson that we as a nation learned from trying but failing with a bunch of tribes in like California, for example. When we take over their ancestral rivers and so forth, and divert a bunch of that water into the imperial valleys so we can all have avocados and almond milk and all that stuff, and just collapse the salmon run in those rivers, for example, it collapses that culture as well. So ANILCA was an effort to say, look, if your peoples are dependent on caribou, if like 98% of your caloric budget for the year is caribou, well then you can continue to hunt that caribou across Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And we're not going to fence you out, and we're not going to fence the caribou out and cause starvation in either case. So it's tricky. There are always a bunch of hairy details with it. Like if you're a native Alaskan and you're hunting caribou, but you're doing it with a Barrett 50 BMG, right? That is an efficient way to hunt, faster than spears. If you're using a snow machine, a snowmobile, does that count as traditional use, right? There are always tricky details and so forth, but this was at least a way to fail forward, right? We didn't get it perfectly right with this, but the assumption was, let's keep things survivable for people first, and we can adjust details later with amendments. That's what Congress does. It might take a while, it might not be pretty, but we can get there. We can keep sort of sharpening the pencil on it until we get it close enough to write. Instead of kicking everybody off, designating the place, and then moving forward that way and seeing how to fix these displaced peoples. Pretty cool difference there. So, 1980, we are fully into the nuclear arms race with Soviet Russia. We're now in the Reagan era. And 1980 and forward is basically our postmodern region here. So, by 1980, most of the legislation that we're going to need to do what we do has been created. And again, we can fine-tune stuff as we go. But this basically brings us to our modern and postmodern era. So we'll pick it up next week with that, right? Ideas about safety in 1980. Innovations in technology in the 80s and 90s. Oh man, soil scientists, this is a way to kill somebody with anxiety, right? Look at all that soil displacement. All right, we're over time. I'm around for questions if you have them. Have a nice weekend otherwise.